June 14, 1943, Pacific Ocean. The morning light falls over a chain of islands that seem impossibly small against the endless blue. Above them, the air trembles. From the east, a formation of F6F Hellcats climbs steadily into the rising sun. Their engines hum with deep, metallic confidence, a sound the Japanese would soon learn to recognize before they ever saw the planes themselves. 1,000 feet below, a squadron of Mitsubishi A6M Zeros cuts across the sky, sleek, fast, and graceful, their pilots disciplined and alert. For months they had ruled these skies. But now, something has changed. The first burst comes like ripping canvas, short, brutal, unrelenting. Tracer lines streak past the Zeros, tearing holes through wings that once danced above every battlefield. The .50 caliber rounds, heavy, high-velocity, armor-piercing, don't just strike, they obliterate. One Zero peels off trailing smoke, then another. The formation scatters, and the blue expanse becomes a killing ground. For the first time, Japanese pilots face an enemy whose firepower dwarfs theirs. An enemy whose machine guns can reach farther, strike harder, and never jam. They had feared many things in war, but nothing matched the sound of those 6 Brownings. The fear had begun. By mid-1943, the Pacific War had entered a new and unforgiving phase. The sweeping conquests that once marked Japan's early dominance, from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies, were beginning to stall. The vast expanse of the ocean that had protected Japan now became its prison, and the empire's once proud air wings were being stretched thin across thousands of miles of hostile territory. In the first months after Pearl Harbor, Japanese naval aviation had seemed unstoppable. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero was a revelation, light, agile, and unmatched in maneuverability. In the hands of experienced pilots, it tore through Allied squadrons from Singapore to Midway. American and British aircraft, heavier and less refined, often stood little chance in a dogfight. Reports from early Pacific campaigns described Zeros darting through the skies like hawks among sparrows. Yet behind those victories lay a quiet vulnerability. The Zero's brilliance came from sacrifice: no armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, minimal protection for the pilot. Every ounce was shaved off for speed and range. In 1941 and 1942, it didn't seem to matter. Japanese pilots believed skill and spirit could outmatch brute force. But by 1943, the nature of air combat had changed, and the Americans were ready. When U.S. forces regrouped after Midway, they began studying every recovered wreck of Japanese aircraft. Engineers from Grumman, Lockheed, and North American Aviation examined fragments of the Zero's fuselage and wings. They realized that its light frame, though nimble, was a fatal flaw against sustained heavy fire. What the Allies needed was not just speed, but a weapon capable of cutting through enemy aircraft with sheer kinetic power. That answer had already existed, it just hadn't yet been unleashed to its full potential. The Browning M2.50 caliber machine gun, designed by John Moses Browning in the final months of World War I, was already in U.S. service across tanks, ships, and aircraft. Chambered for the massive 12.7 by 99 mm round, it delivered devastating energy at high velocity and long range. But before 1942, many U.S. fighters carried a mix of smaller caliber weapons or twin mounts that lacked volume of fire. The coming battles in the Pacific would change that forever. As new American aircraft rolled off assembly lines, they came equipped with multiple M2S for 6, sometimes even 8. The P-40 Warhawk, the F4F Wildcat, and later the P-47 Thunderbolt and F6F Hellcat all shared this brutal common denominator. Engineers found ways to mount these guns so precisely aligned that their streams of fire converged perfectly ahead of the aircraft. A deadly cone of destruction, through which few enemy planes could pass and survive. The Japanese had nothing comparable. Their 7.7 mm machine guns were light and fast-firing, but their rounds shattered harmlessly against the thick skin of American bombers and fighters. Even their heavier 20 mm cannons, limited by low ammunition capacity and slow rates of fire, often failed to bring down rugged U.S. planes before being outgunned. By the summer of 1943, American pilots in the Pacific were beginning to notice the difference. They no longer had to rely on tight-turning duels. Instead, they fought with confidence, diving in from altitude, firing short, disciplined bursts, and climbing away before the enemy could react. In these attacks, the .50 caliber did the talking. It shredded wings, cracked engine mounts, and exploded fuel tanks in seconds. The fear spread quickly through Japanese ranks. Pilots returning from missions described the terrifying streams of tracer fire, long, bright lines that seemed impossible to dodge. Squadrons began losing veterans faster than they could train replacements. And deep within Japan's Naval Air Command, planners realized that the tide of the Pacific sky had shifted for good. In the clouds over the Solomon Islands, the duel for air supremacy was no longer about grace or finesse. It had become a contest of endurance, technology, and industrial power. And in that new contest, America's answer came not from one pilot, but from one weapon. By late 1943, the U.S. war machine was running at a pace no other nation could match. Every month, American factories rolled out thousands of aircraft, each more rugged and heavily armed than the last. The United States had turned its industrial might into a weapon of survival, and nowhere was this more evident than in the standardization of the Browning M2.50 caliber machine gun. From the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress to the North American P-51 Mustang, this weapon became the unifying symbol of Allied air power. It could be mounted in wings, turrets, or flexible positions. It performed in the freezing altitudes over Europe and the sweltering humidity of the South Pacific. It fired armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds interchangeably, with devastating results against both aircraft and ground targets. Each .50 caliber bullet weighed nearly 2 ounces and traveled at over 2,900 feet per second. A 6-gun fighter could unleash 70 rounds a second, a hailstorm of metal that could rip through aluminum, fuel tanks, and engines in an instant. When combined with disciplined American gunnery training, it gave even average pilots the firepower once reserved for ace fighters. In the Pacific, the Navy's new F6F Hellcat became the perfect companion to the Browning. Designed by Grumman to replace the outclassed Wildcat, it was built like a flying fortress in miniature, strong, fast, and forgiving. Each wing carried 3 M2 machine guns, synchronized to converge their fire 250 yards ahead of the nose. When a Hellcat dove into combat, it could deliver a storm of bullets so concentrated that entire formations of Japanese Zeros seemed to vanish within seconds. Japanese pilots soon began to speak of the shattering thunder, the unique, rhythmic roar of 6 Brownings firing in unison. Intelligence intercepts and post-war interviews reveal a deep psychological impact. One pilot from the 582nd Kokutai recalled, "You could not escape it. You saw the fire, and in the next heartbeat your airplane was gone." The Americans, meanwhile, had learned to rely on teamwork and coordination rather than individual duels. Navy and Marine Corps pilots operated under discipline doctrines: boom and zoom, thatch weave, high side attacks. These tactics exploited the range and power of the .50 caliber, allowing them to strike from advantage and withdraw before the lighter Zeros could turn into position. The combination of industrial standardization and tactical refinement began reshaping the Pacific Air War. At Guadalcanal, New Georgia, and Bougainville, the U.S. steadily pushed Japanese forces from the skies. Pilots reported that enemy aircraft, once deadly in close combat, now seemed fragile, unable to sustain hits or deliver enough firepower to win head-on engagements. On the ground, maintenance crews praised the M2 for its reliability. Even in salt air, tropical rain, and the fine coral dust of island airstrips, the weapon rarely jammed. Spare parts were interchangeable, ammunition belts easily reloaded, and gunners could strip and reassemble the weapon in the dark. The Japanese, by contrast, struggled with supply and design limitations. Their 20mm Type 99 cannons required precise handling and were prone to overheating. Ammunition quality varied, and spare parts were scarce. As the war dragged on and Japan's factories faced shortages of aluminum and steel, production quality fell further, a quiet collapse that compounded the loss of veteran airmen. By 1944, American air groups were no longer fighting for survival. They were fighting for mastery. The skies that had once belonged to the Empire of Japan now echoed with the mechanical rhythm of Browning guns. a sound that symbolized not only technological superiority but industrial inevitability. The .50 caliber was no longer just a machine gun. It was the heartbeat of American air power. And from that heartbeat came fear. A fear that would follow Japanese pilots into every battle that lay ahead. The Browning M2 was not born from wartime urgency. It was the product of patient engineering. Designed in 1918, refined through the interwar years, and field-tested long before the Pacific Campaign, it entered World War II as one of the most perfected weapons ever made. Its secret lay in balance, weight, power, rate of fire, and reliability, all harmonized into a machine that could be adapted to any platform, from bomber turrets to fighter wings. Each M2 fired the .50 BMG cartridge, Browning machine gun, a round nearly 5 inches long and nearly half an inch wide. It was a scaled-up version of the rifle bullet, but with over 10 times the kinetic energy. Fired at speeds approaching 900 meters per second, it could punch through armor plate, engine blocks, or even the thick structure of an aircraft's wing spar. Unlike the lighter Japanese 7.7mm rounds, the .50 BMG didn't just damage, it destroyed. But the weapon's brilliance wasn't just in raw power. It was in its mechanical simplicity. The M2's recoil-operated action, belt-fed system, and slow-cooling barrel made it incredibly resilient in combat. Pilots could fire hundreds of rounds without jamming, a rarity in wartime aviation. This meant that American pilots could dive into an engagement, unleash devastating bursts, and climb away without fear that their guns would seize. In aerial combat, that trust mattered more than anything. American aircraft designers integrated the M2 directly into the identity of their planes. The F6F Wildcat carried 4. The P-47 Thunderbolt carried 8. The later P-51 Mustang, perhaps the most elegant fighter of the war, mounted 6. Every bullet fired was part of a carefully calculated convergence point. At 250 yards, the streams met in a small, deadly space. Any aircraft caught in that space would be shredded within seconds. In the Pacific, these guns also redefined tactics. Gone were the tight-turning duels that the nimble Zero had mastered. American pilots now relied on altitude, speed, and overwhelming firepower. They learned to strike once, hard and fast, then disengage before the enemy could respond. The boom and zoom tactic, pioneered by the U.S. Army Air Forces and the Navy alike, made full use of the .50 caliber's range and accuracy. When Japanese planes tried to return fire, they found their weapons hopelessly outclassed. The 7.7mm machine gun was effective only at close range. Their 20mm cannons, though powerful, had limited ammunition and suffered from slow rates of fire. The result was a tactical imbalance. American fighters could strike from a distance, while Japanese pilots had to get dangerously close to have any chance of success. That imbalance grew with every encounter. Reports from Pacific Fleet intelligence units in late 1943 noted that enemy aircraft no longer seek prolonged combat. They attempt single passes and rapid disengagement. The Japanese didn't lose their courage. They lost their confidence in their machines. The M2 was more than a weapon. It was a doctrine in metal, precision, reliability, and overwhelming force. Every American fighter that roared into the Pacific sky carried it as both a tool and a symbol. It spoke the language of industry, of steel, and of inevitability. And for Japanese pilots, hearing that sound meant one thing: their era of superiority was ending. By 1944, the Pacific Air War had become a crucible of endurance, a contest not just of machines but of men. The Japanese naval aviators, who had once flown with unmatched confidence, now faced an enemy they could scarcely comprehend. Each mission brought them against planes that climbed faster, dove steeper, and struck harder than anything they had encountered in the early days of the war. And the sound that haunted their dreams was not the scream of engines, but the hammering rhythm of 6 Browning .50 caliber guns. To the American pilots who fired them, the .50s were instruments of survival. A Hellcat pilot from VF5 later recalled, "You pulled the trigger and felt the whole plane vibrate. You could almost hear the metal doing your work for you." The weapon's recoil, its rhythmic pounding through the fuselage, became a kind of heartbeat, reassurance that the pilot was armed with something unstoppable. To the Japanese on the receiving end, it was an entirely different experience. Combat reports and post-war testimonies from surviving Zero pilots describe encounters that ended before they began. One recalled, "We saw flashes, like threads of fire in the sky. Then the wind came through the cockpit, holes everywhere. It was over before I even pulled the trigger." For decades, the Zero had symbolized Japanese mastery of the air, the perfect fusion of pilot skill and engineering elegance. But against the storm of .50 caliber fire, elegance was meaningless. The American planes could absorb punishment, return devastating fire, and keep flying. The Japanese, bound by their own design philosophy of lightweight agility, could not. This imbalance created a new psychological warfare of its own. Reports from Japanese naval staff noted that pilots returning from combat often spoke of unbreakable American aircraft and lightning gunfire that destroys in 1 second. In truth, the .50 caliber had become an extension of American doctrine: quantity, precision, and power applied at scale. Even ground crews felt its impact. Allied gunners on bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator manned networks of interlocking .50 caliber turrets. Japanese fighter pilots who dove on bomber formations often found themselves trapped in a web of tracer lines. Each gunner could independently track, fire, and overlap coverage with others, creating a near-impenetrable defensive shield. Many Japanese pilots never made it out of their first pass. American reports noted with grim accuracy that Japanese fighters began attacking less aggressively by late 1944. Intercepts grew shorter, scattered, and hesitant. What had once been the daring, fearless Zero tactics of 1941 were now fleeting flashes, attacks followed by retreat. Behind that change was exhaustion, both physical and emotional. Japan's most experienced aviators had been lost over the Solomons, New Guinea, and the Marianas. Their replacements, trained hastily and flown into combat with minimal experience, were no match for seasoned U.S. pilots backed by industrial firepower. For many, the first time they faced American fighters was also their last. The .50 caliber did more than dominate the air. It reshaped the psychology of the Pacific War. Every Japanese pilot who strapped into his cockpit understood that one mistake, one brief appearance in a Hellcat sights, could mean instant annihilation. The sky, once their domain, had turned into a field of thunder, and that thunder carried a message they could not ignore. The United States now ruled the air. June 19, 1944, Philippine Sea. It was midday when over 400 Japanese aircraft launched from 9 carriers, racing eastward toward the American fleet. This was the largest air assault Japan had mounted since Midway, their attempt to halt the U.S. advance toward the Marianas. But what awaited them was not the same U.S. Navy they had once faced. It was a new machine, precise, coordinated, and armed to the teeth with .50 caliber firepower. The Battle of the Philippine Sea would become immortalized as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a name earned in the skies that afternoon. American Hellcats from Task Force 58 climbed to intercept the incoming waves. Radar screens aboard carriers lit up with hundreds of dots, each one a Japanese aircraft. Over the radio came a calm, steady voice. "Get them before they reach the fleet." The Hellcats descended through the clouds in disciplined formations. They didn't turn fight. They didn't improvise. They dove straight into the enemy lines, unleashing torrents of .50 caliber fire. Each Hellcat carried 6 M2 guns loaded with 400 rounds per weapon, nearly 2,400 chances to strike in each sortie. When those guns opened up, the air filled with a solid, continuous roar. Japanese pilots, many of them barely trained teenagers, were flying aircraft inferior in both armor and range. Their Zeros were lightly built and easily torn apart. Reports from the USS Lexington and Enterprise describe entire squadrons being wiped out within minutes of first contact. In some cases, a single Hellcat would down 4 or 5 enemy aircraft before its ammunition belts ran dry. The .50 caliber rounds ripped through the thin aluminum skins of Zeros, detonating fuel tanks and snapping wings from fuselages. Gun camera footage later analyzed by Navy intelligence showed short, 2-second bursts turning enemy planes into fireballs. Pilots often described the sensation not as shooting, but as sawing through the air, the tracers forming bright, unbroken lines of death across the sky. By the end of the day, more than 300 Japanese aircraft were lost. The Americans, protected by their .50 caliber armed fighters and disciplined radar coordination, lost fewer than 30. It was the single most one-sided air battle in naval history. The Japanese fleet, which had once dominated the Pacific, was now defenseless from above. Its carriers became floating coffins, stripped of air cover. The loss of pilots was far more catastrophic than the loss of planes. Japan could not replace its veterans, but America's production lines could deliver new aircraft faster than they could be deployed. From that day forward, Japan would never again contest air superiority in the Pacific. The legend of the Zero ended not in glory, but in a storm of American bullets. Every Japanese pilot who took off from those carriers that day knew what he was flying into, the roaring curtain of the Browning .50 caliber. And behind that thunder was an empire of industry, precision, and men who had learned how to turn a machine gun into a force of history. The victory in the Philippine Sea was more than a battle won. It was the definitive collapse of Japanese air power. Yet, for the U.S., it was only the beginning of a relentless advance across the Pacific. From the carrier decks of the Essex class to the forward airfields carved into coral and jungle, the thunder of the .50 caliber followed every step. In the months that followed, American forces swept through Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Each island brought the front line closer to Japan itself. The skies above these battlefields were filled with the roar of Pratt and Whitney engines and the hammering rhythm of the Browning guns. Fighter bombers like the F6F Hellcat and the F4U Corsair strafed runways, convoys, and anti-aircraft positions with merciless precision. Every pass left trails of fire and twisted metal, the result of high-velocity bullets punching through anything that stood exposed. The Japanese pilots who survived the Philippine Sea found no reprieve. Many were reassigned to homeland defense or kamikaze units, flying older aircraft in desperate missions. They entered combat knowing that even before reaching their targets, they would face a storm of .50 caliber rounds from American interceptors or the defensive rings of bombers. Those bombers, B-24 Liberators and B-29 Superfortresses, carried entire networks of Browning guns. Each aircraft bristled with up to 12 M2s, positioned in turrets controlled by gyroscopic sights and centralized firing systems. They were not just bombers, they were flying fortresses. Japanese interceptors attempting head-on attacks were shredded by overlapping streams of heavy-caliber fire before they ever came within range. In late 1944, during the raids over Formosa and the Philippines, Japanese command reports described unbreakable formations and fire curtains impossible to penetrate. Pilots who had once trusted speed and maneuver were now forced into suicidal attacks, diving straight into gunfire in hopes of striking a lucky blow. The results were devastating. One captured Japanese officer told U.S. interrogators, "Our bullets could not destroy your planes. Yours destroyed us instantly." Even at sea, the story was the same. The twin-engine PBJ and B-25 Mitchell bombers strafed Japanese shipping lines, tearing through cargo decks with .50 caliber nose guns. Navy PT boats carried twin mounts for coastal raids, while amphibious landings were supported by aircraft unleashing waves of gunfire ahead of Marines hitting the beaches. The .50 caliber became the common language of American might, air, land, and sea united through the same weapon. By early 1945, the last remnants of Japan's Air Force were fighting a war of desperation. Aircraft quality had fallen, fuel supplies were dwindling, and pilot experience was almost non-existent. The Browning-armed U.S. planes now dominated every altitude, every mission profile, every hour of daylight. From Iwo Jima to Okinawa, Japanese defenders faced a sky that seemed permanently American, a sky filled with thunder. The fear that had begun over the Solomon Islands had now spread to the home islands themselves. When the engines of P-51 Mustangs echoed over Tokyo, civilians and soldiers alike knew what followed. A symphony of heavy guns tearing the silence apart. The weapon that began as a single machine gun design had become a symbol of industrial vengeance, a sound that no Japanese pilot could ever forget. And with every pull of the trigger, the end drew closer. By the spring of 1945, the Pacific War had become a mechanical storm. Japan's Air Force, Once the terror of the Pacific was now a ghost. The dominance of American firepower, symbolized by the .50 caliber Browning, had erased the tactical advantage Japan once held. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa made this truth impossible to ignore. Above the beaches, the sky belonged entirely to the United States. Swarms of P-51 Mustangs and F-4U Corsairs swept over Japanese positions, strafing trenches, convoys, and cave mouths with relentless precision. Marines on the ground often described the sound of .50 caliber bursts as both comfort and terror. Comfort because it meant friendly aircraft were overhead. Terror because they knew what that same fire did to the enemy. Each mission delivered cold arithmetic. A Corsair typically carried 6 M2 Brownings, each firing 800 rounds per minute. One 10-second burst could send nearly 800 armor-piercing bullets toward a target. Multiply that by a dozen aircraft in formation, and the battlefield became a storm of metal. No lightly armored Japanese aircraft, truck, or gun emplacement could survive it. For the Japanese pilots who still took to the air, the experience was often suicidal. Kamikaze missions became the grim substitute for conventional air combat. Many were barely trained. Young men rushed into cockpits with minimal instruction, armed with courage but no hope of survival. Against the disciplined formations of American fighters and bombers, they stood no chance. Before they could reach their targets, most were ripped apart by streams of .50 caliber fire that shredded wings and ignited fuel tanks in midair. Allied intelligence units compiled reports describing the growing desperation in Japanese ranks. Aircraft maintenance logs were incomplete. Spare parts had vanished. Even ammunition was scarce. The Imperial Japanese Navy's once proud air arm was reduced to fragments. A few surviving Zeros, a handful of Ki-43 Oscars, and prototypes that never reached production. The pilots who had once flown over Pearl Harbor now watched from the ground as B-29s filled their skies. Those bombers carried the same guns that had destroyed the Japanese fighter force, .50 caliber M2S mounted in automated turrets. The superfortress's formation firepower was unmatched. Crews often reported seeing attackers vaporized by the sheer concentration of fire. At 30,000 feet, Japanese defenders could do little but watch as cities below vanished in firestorms. In that final year, the psychological effect of the .50 caliber became almost as significant as its physical destruction. It represented industrial supremacy, the sheer weight of American production, precision engineering, and logistics. Every gun, every bullet, every aircraft bore the mark of an economy that could outbuild, outgun, and outlast its enemy. By the time of Japan's surrender in August 1945, over 500,000 Browning M2S had been produced. They guarded bombers, lined tanks, protected ships, and armed the aircraft that ruled the Pacific. From Midway to Tokyo Bay, their echo had become the soundtrack of Allied victory. The weapon that Japanese pilots feared most had not only ended their dominance, it had defined the very sound of defeat. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. When the guns finally fell silent, the Pacific was no longer the same ocean. The roar of radial engines and the rattle of .50 caliber bursts had given way to a heavy stillness. On the deck of the USS Missouri, Japanese officers stood stiff and pale as they signed the instrument of surrender. Around them, rows of American sailors looked on, young men who had lived through the fury of the skies and the sound of the Brownings. For the Japanese aviators who survived, the realization was bitter. They had entered the war flying the most advanced fighter in the world, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. Lightweight, agile, and deadly in 1941, it had ruled the Pacific for nearly a year. But by 1943, the .50 caliber Browning had rewritten the laws of air combat. The weapon was brutally simple, yet devastatingly efficient, an equalizer that turned American pilots into masters of the sky. Captured reports and pilot testimonies after the war reveal just how deep the fear had run. Some Japanese pilots admitted that once tracer fire from AP-51 or F6F streaked past their cockpit, panic took over. They knew that even one hit could tear through the engine block or ignite the fuel tank. The .50 caliber's range and velocity made escape nearly impossible. Its reputation spread faster than propaganda ever could. In training schools across Japan, Instructors whispered warnings to new pilots. Avoid the Americans head-on. Avoid the Brownings. But by 1945, there was nowhere left to avoid them. American fighters swept from Iwo Jima to the home islands, clearing the skies with mechanical precision. The last air battles over Japan, small, chaotic duels against hopeless odds, ended almost as quickly as they began. After the surrender, U.S. ordnance teams surveyed the ruins of Japan's aircraft industry. What they found was sobering. Wrecked factories, improvised workshops, aircraft frames built from wood and bamboo. Fuel was gone, metals were scarce, and the once proud Zero was now a relic, shattered by the relentless advance of American firepower. The Browning M2 had done more than dominate the battlefield. It had become a symbol of industrial discipline, of precision design, of American resilience. In every theater, from the frozen Aleutians to the jungles of the Philippines, it had delivered the same verdict: reliability wins wars. When historians later traced the downfall of Japan's air superiority, they didn't point only to radar or numbers or strategy. They pointed to the American .50 caliber, the weapon that could tear through wings, engines, and morale with equal force. For the men who fired it, the sound became a mark of survival. For those who faced it, it became the sound of inevitability. On that calm morning in Tokyo Bay, as the papers were signed and the flags lowered, one could still imagine the echo, faint, distant, of the gunfire that had changed everything. And in that silence, the Pacific finally exhaled. The story of the .50 caliber Browning is not just about engineering. It is about the balance between innovation and endurance, the meeting of human courage and mechanical perfection. In the Pacific, it became more than a weapon. It became a language. The sound of those heavy rounds tearing through the air spoke of a nation's determination to outthink, outbuild, and outlast its enemies. American pilots didn't just rely on firepower. They trusted in a weapon that never failed them, no matter the heat, the altitude, or the distance from home. To the Japanese, the .50 caliber symbolized something far greater than metal and gunpowder. It represented an industrial will they could not match, a precision culture of mass production that could turn design into dominance. Every tracer line cutting through the Pacific sky was a message. The age of light, graceful dogfighting was over. The age of overwhelming firepower had begun. When the war ended, the Browning M2 remained. It still serves today, almost unchanged, on tanks, helicopters, and ships around the world. A silent reminder of the weapon that defined an era. And for those who once fought beneath the Pacific sun, that deep metallic rhythm, steady, confident, unstoppable, would forever echo in memory. The sound of victory, the sound that Japanese pilots feared more than any other.